Hi, I'm Peter Williams. I'm the author of Productive Accidents, a playbook for personal and professional adventure. I'm a Treasury professional based in Singapore, but I'm also a serial volunteer. I'm on the board of Music for Life International based in New York and Resolve Foundation based in Hong Kong. In today's show, we're going to talk about the importance of saying yes and getting comfortable outside your comfort zone. We're going to talk about the importance of connection and how you can turn those into compound collaboration. And finally, we're going to talk about the importance of breaking down some of the lies about innovation and realizing that it should be a playful adventure and it should turn your life into an adventure. Innovation is code for making cool things happen. And the more that you play with your life and the interests that you have and the people that you get connected to and the more diversity you have, the more powerful you're going to be at creating creativity, innovation, and value for your company, shareholders, stakeholders, and the community more broadly. So I look forward to talking to you on the show.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. In a world where most of us are feeling pretty overworked or overstressed, it's become in vogue to get good at saying no. And as much as that makes sense, and it does, we must also consider the other side, which is getting good at saying yes and getting out of our comfort zones in order to do that. But how do we do it? How do we sort out what to say yes to without ending up in overwhelm? Moreover, what if yes is actually a pathway to innovation and something that our next guest calls productive accidents? More about that in a moment. As always, we need your help in staying relevant, so please get over to wherever you tune into the podcast. Maybe it's Apple, maybe it's Google, maybe it's some other app. Do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. Those things make a huge difference to us. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. We are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. We also just made the top 50 leadership podcasts in the world and a bunch of other awards, which is pretty cool. Thank you very much. I know you're curious. My name is Dov Baron. I am your host, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Our guest for the next 2 episodes is Peter Williams. Peter Williams grew up in rural Australia on a BMX and skateboards. He went on to create a global career in finance. He is a serial volunteer serving on boards of Music for Life International based in New York and Resolve Foundation in Hong Kong. He is a Treasury Innovation Professional. He is a Citi director. As I said, he's with the Resolve Foundation and advisory chair, board, author, speaker, podcast host. And his second book is called Productive Accidents. It shows us how to create a framework for innovation that can also turn your life into an evolving adventure. Peter and his wife and 4 kids have been living in Asia since 2001. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome, all the way from Singapore, Mr. Peter Williams. And the crowd goes wild, young man.
Yes, it does. I can imagine it right now. Thank you for that kind introduction. That was amazing.
Good to have you on, mate. I appreciate it. We've had a conversation quite a while back, almost a year ago, It was still COVID times when we previously chatted. You were still living in Hong Kong at that time, and now you're over in Singapore. You have made your life about adventure. You've made your life about moving from different places. I know that you travel all over the world. I know that you invite people into your homes. We're going to get into all of that in a moment, but let's start here. What is the origin story of what gives your life meaning?
I actually do think it boils down to two words, and it's connection and then collaboration. So every person I meet, I challenge myself to find shared interests. And then the next obvious step is, okay, how do we collaborate to advance whatever that is? It could be a game of golf, a game of tennis, a charity, NGO, startup, it could be anything.
So, but what is it about that for you? What about that gives you meaning? What is it about that desire to collaborate?
Well, ultimately, it's about my curiosity and my interest in people, and lifelong learning is a thing. And the more interests that you maintain, the more interesting you become by definition. But I still prefer to listen to people's stories. I love hearing, where they're from, what did they do when they were growing up, what were their passions, and then what happened, and then what happened, and then what happened. And just that series of conversations has led to so many interesting introductions. Like, I'm just jumping to a memory where I met a gentleman at a golf course in Japan, and he sort of kept on walking past me and looking like he wanted to have a conversation, but then he didn't. And then eventually I said, hey, what's your story? And it turns out he grew up in Japan, but went to a boarding school in Australia, in Brisbane. And then I said, okay, then what happened? He said, well, then I went to university in the US. And I said, then what happened? Then I worked for, Solomon Brothers. And I said, then what happened? And I said, well, my wife works for PIMCO. And he said, well, I helped place the person that now runs PIMCO in Japan. And just for that small series of conversations, we invited he and his wife to a barbecue at our place. We have a place in Niseka, which is also an outcome of this, journey. And he's become, this regular meetup person. And whenever I'm in town, I say, hey, do you want to play golf? And, he and his wife are always up for it. So little things like that always turn into this amazing series of memories. And that's why I had to write the book, because you do that for 10 years and it takes 4 hours to actually describe it. Eventually it becomes more efficient to just say, look, here's a book and read about it.
When so I talked about how you grew up in rural Australia. Do you put any of it down to that? Because, I was born in a big city in a ghetto environment. But what I've learned in all my travels is everywhere's a village. It's part of my, you go to everybody goes, oh my God, New York's so big. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's just a series of villages. And I've lived in small places and I've lived in big places. I personally prefer big places, but I always see even areas of villages. Do you think that growing up rural gave you any of that sort of piece?
Definitely. I mean, my hometown is Armidale in northern New South Wales, 25,000 people. There's a university there called the University of New England, obviously a different type of New England to the one that's, north of New York. It's farming area, sheep, cattle. My parents had a farm machinery business selling, Massey Ferguson tractors. So that was, I guess, one productive accident is that we had tractors around that could push up some dirt and I could shape them into jumps and ride my BMX with my mates, So that type of thing was there. But I always knew, I guess, I'd head off to Sydney for university. And that's where I did go to New South Wales University and studied commerce. But even productive accidents started to happen, through that adventure. But I'll get into that maybe a bit later on. But one of my favourite small towns is where my eldest sister lives, in a place called Coolaman in southwest New South Wales, only 3,000 people. And I've been going there since I was about 12. I used to visit her when she was visiting her boyfriend from university. It's an 18-hour bus ride for a 12-year-old, and it was like flying to London.
18-hour bus ride?
Yeah. And I'm 12, and, that was okay back then, The place was relatively safe. I don't think you'd be too keen to let a 12-year-old do that these days.
No. That's funny. Yeah, I mean, that whole, when people think about Australia, you know this. I lived in Australia, as you know, before I moved here. And, people, it's really always very fascinating to me to think about how people see Australia. because they don't see all the massive amount in the middle, right? And they think of Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne as being sort of next door to each other, and Perth being a little bit further away, but still not that far. And it's like, it's so massive and so spread out. And, to go an 18-hour bus ride to go see your sister is like...
And that's just one tiny part of New South Wales.
Exactly.
To drive from Armidale to Brisbane is 6 hours north. To Armidale to Sydney is 6 hours south.
Right.
And, Perth, never even thought about going there because you might as well go overseas. I only went to Perth when we moved to Singapore and because if you're going to go that far, you might as well go somewhere, somewhere else,
Absolutely.
Get out of the country at least.
Yeah. I when I lived in Australia, I spent a lot of time on the East Coast, but I lived in Perth, and it was fascinating to me how many people in Perth had never been to the East Coast. And when I go to Sydney or Brisbane, how many people had never been to Perth. Just totally. Was like it, because it literally is, it's another country. It's another culture. It's a different speed. And as you said, it's so far away that people are like, well, I'd rather go to
Might as well go to Bali. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, yeah. Because that's, it's at least...
That's part of the reason why we used to avoid Bali, because we thought, why would you go there? There's too many Australians, right? Exactly. And so, but we eventually went there, and if there are areas where you can avoid the Australians, and it's actually really cool. So
it's funny. The reason I never went to Spain, because it was full of pommies. Because it's full of Brits. It's the same thing.
People ask why our children don't go to the Australian school. So why would we live overseas and send our kids to hang around with a bunch of Australians? What's the point? Make the most of this opportunity, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So the name of the book is Productive Accidents. Define what it means to a productive accident, because I think that's up for interpretation, and it's easy for people to maybe misunderstand what it means.
Yeah, no, it's based on research that a professor from the University of Chicago did. He went back 100 years, Professor Ron Burt, and looked at how does innovation happen. And he looked at people like Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, everyone in between, and did research to try and identify what were the common denominators across these people. And he tried to objectively measure what those factors were. And one of the key drivers of their success, creativity, was the diversity of their network and their range of interests. And you can create a formula off that. The more diverse your network and the more interests you have, the more likely you're going to see something that's routine in one industry that could be revolutionary in yours if you twist it and recombine it in new ways. And that's how innovation happens. Nothing is really invented. We're just repackaging existing ideas in new ways. And what the great thing about that research, the professor could have ended the class right there, sat the exam, and we could have walked away. The best thing he did from my point of view was that he distilled all of that research into a single phrase: put yourself at risk of productive accident. As a career piece of advice, put yourself out there. So you're getting outside your comfort zone. There's no guarantees because it's at risk. It might work, it may not. But productive accidents, you can transfer that or translate that into serendipity or happenstance or something interesting or something magical, however you want to phrase it. Mm-hmm. But in honor of his work, I've called it Productive Accidents. And then the subtitle has become a playbook for personal and professional adventure, because what I worked out, when you apply this idea, you keep that as a filter for all these opportunities. And there's unlimited opportunities in our lives. People are always, particularly if you're a serial volunteer, because there's not a lot of competition when you're prepared to volunteer for stuff. Because people say, well, why would I do that? What's in it for me? I get more energy and motivation, and I get, literally the energy is when I'm helping other people without expecting anything in return. And that's an uncommon approach to things, but I have found a tribe of like-minded people around the world, and that's who I try to feature in this book. And it's, we might only meet each other for half an hour, but that's enough with a structured conversation to form a lifelong friendship. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these people like Jeff Rotmeyer, who you had on the show, not long ago. I met him when he spoke at Creative Mornings. How did I end up going to Creative Mornings? And, I'm a guy working in a bank, and this is a platform for people that work in design, architecture, advertising, etc. I went there because I supported a documentary called The Helper. And it was about amplifying appreciation for domestic workers. And my wife and I, there's no way we'd both be working. There's no way we'd have 4 children if it wasn't for Ivy David, who's been with us for 17 years looking after our four children. So
Right.
she's, I always call her our chief operating officer. She's our logistics guru. She knows what's happening with all the kids. And with, whenever we have friends visiting or family, we have a lot of visitors coming through. And that's also become a tradition that we've created. Like, you come up with these traditions of having people come and stay with you is much more fulfilling for everyone than for them to go and stay at a hotel, because we get to hang out more and they get to see how we live. And the unexpected benefit is our children have had this sort of living library come through our home over the last 21 years we've been in Asia, and that's priceless as far as I'm concerned.
So let's go back to this. So how did, because volunteering is, I don't know that it's, I don't know that it's as productive as we'd like to think it is a lot of the times. A lot of people have got a lot of hang-ups about volunteering now. There's all kinds of stuff around that without getting into, I don't want to get into any details, but why did you decide to do that? Was that something that was sort of in your nature, or was that part of this philosophy of putting yourself at risk of these productive accidents? What was it that was the catalyst for you?
I think a few things happened. When I heard him say that phrase in the class, I literally started to have flashbacks to situations where I had actually already done that in my past. And so that's what made it reinforce the message and why it resonated so much. So let's connect the dots. Went from Armidale to Sydney. After a number of years working in an accounting firm, I went, this is not my thing. Let's go into investments, and started working there. Got transferred to London literally 25 years ago this year. So 97. And my wife and I, were married by then. And at the end of it, we traveled around Europe for 3 months. And just by chance, we met a couple from Singapore. And I didn't know anything about Asia, really. I'd never really been out of Australia much. And I said, look, what's the national language of Singapore? I was just curious. And they said, oh, it's English. And I said, how does that happen? You're between Malaysia and Indonesia. It doesn't make sense. So we had not booked our return flight at that stage. So I deliberately said, let's touch down in Singapore and just check it out, because it sounds, kind of interesting. And, little did we know that 3 or 4 years later, we'd return for 3-year-old and stay here for 9 years and have 3 of our 4 children born here, then go to Hong Kong with this amazing adventure after graduating from the Chicago Booth MBA, and putting all that stuff into practice around productive accidents, enough content to generate a book or 2, right? So, and now we're back. So we've got this chance to reflect. Half of my class from business school are still based in Singapore. So I've got, 40 out of the 90 people roughly are still here, plus all these other friends that have drifted back from Hong Kong or that were here throughout the whole period. So let me go back to make sure, am I answering your question? What happened when I went to Hong Kong was, like, I suddenly had all this spare time on my hands. I was studying and working full time. When you take the study out of it, it's suddenly like, okay, what am I going to do with that? And I'd been playing quite a bit of golf in Singapore, but Hong Kong, it's much harder. So I switched to tennis. I'd never played competitive tennis. I joined a club there called the Ladies Recreation Club. And they needed
I got news for you. You're not passing as a lady. No more than
it's all good. It's all good. Yeah, that's a recurring joke. We all wear skirts. It's cool. And I joined this tennis team, and they said, "Look, we need a captain." And they must have seen me as a bit of a sucker, right? I just joined the club, and my first reaction was, "No, that sounds like a bunch of admin." But then I thought, let's just step back and see if this approach is useful, like this productive accidents. I said, "Look, just tell me a bit more about the team." They said, "Well, look, there's 40 guys. They're fresh grads out of university, right up to retired partners at law firms, investment firms, lots of different industries, lots of different nationalities, lots of different skill sets." And I just went, well, that seems like a recipe for productive accidents. I don't know what's going to happen, but something interesting is going to happen if you get to know these people more. So I said yes. My first act as captain was to send an email to the team saying, look, who are you? Where are you from? what do you do? Do you have any children? Where do they go to school? Maybe my kids know yours. I was looking for some overlap.
Yeah.
Then I said, look, I've never played competitive tennis before. How are we going to win this game? Are we going to be at the net or baseline, whatever? And then the best question I asked was a throwaway thing at the end where I said, look, just tell me something interesting about yourself. What makes you tick? What are you passionate about? 5 minutes later, I had emails coming back individually saying, oh, yeah, I worked in investment banking for 20 years now. I'm doing property development in Niseko. I'm like, what the hell's Niseko? Powder Snow Heaven, Hokkaido. Fast forward, we built a house next door to this guy. And that's become an adventure. So little things like that just kept on snowballing. And, now we go and work out of Japan. We go to the Fuji Rock Festival on the way out of, working there. And, all of these things lead to the point where some people say, well, do you even work? It's gotten to the point where, what you do for fun and what you do for work are totally integrated. And that's by design, right? I always reverse engineer any trip. I say, well, what else could I bolt on at the front or at the end or in between to turn it to some new adventure? And, there's lots of examples of that.
So again, the question was around volunteering though. What made you decide to volunteer? Was that that being the team manager that was a volunteer position?
No, actually, it goes back further than that.
Okay.
While we were in Singapore, my parents brought a biography of a woman from Australia, Gemma Rice, who became Gemma Sissia, and it was her story of going off to Tanzania and volunteering, and in orphanages, and then eventually someone donated land, and then people raised some money, mainly in Australia. And she built a school with some of her brothers and went across and built this very basic brick structure. And I think the school started in 2002 called the School of St. Jude, which is basically the school for hopeless causes. And she wanted to give people living in poverty. It is. It's pretty amazing. And it's definitely not, a religious sort of angle. It's just like this is the way she grew up and she wanted to honor that. They welcome everyone from anywhere, but you have to be in severe poverty, and they have criteria for that. They get 3,000 kids looking for 20 positions each year. So I read this book, and by that stage it was 2007. It was during the financial crisis, 2008, and I was going, look, the world, share prices are going to zero, but at least we've got food and we've got shelter. Here's someone doing something real in the world. And I wrote an email to Gemma at the end saying, look, what you've done is amazing. Congratulations. Keep up the good work. And by the way, we have a mutual friend. She actually grew up in the town where my father was from, was Gyra, which is half an hour north of Armidale. And my parents had actually sold her parents' tractors. So there was some linkage, but we didn't know each other. Mm-hmm. And, I guess it was evening Singapore, morning Tanzania. And it was just like we sent each other a WhatsApp. She came immediately back. We started this conversation. We sponsored a child. The next month, I think we discovered that they were doing a speaking tour of Australia. So we said, look, why don't you reroute your flights and come via Singapore, stay with us, and I'll organize a bunch of events. So with that, 2 weeks before I think she arrived, we did 5 events in about 3 days. And so that's what, to me was the power of volunteering and just inviting people into your home and then just, letting things evolve,
Well, we're coming towards the end of this first part of the conversation because in the second part, I want to talk about this open door policy you have in your home for Hotel Williams, where and what that's meant to you, to your family, and how that has sort of opened up this whole adventure around these productive accidents. I want to come to that in part 2 of the show. However, right now, I want to make sure that people get to find out where you are, find out more about you, about your book, and about the extensive list of things you do, how people can tap into you and tap into the resources. So please, if you would share that with our audience, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. I think the best way to connect to me is through LinkedIn. So Peter B. Williams. I put the B in the middle there because there's a lot of Peter Williamses out there.
Sure.
And, I did create my own website. Everything I self-published both times in the books because I'm treating this as like a minimum viable product. I want to learn as much as, distribute these ideas. And what I'm more interested in is, what happens next. I want people to read the book, listen to the audiobook and reach out and say, hey, I heard this and it intrigued me and it reminded me of X, and have you thought of Y, and have you met Z? And I want next chapters of the next book to be created through our conversations today.
Okay. So LinkedIn is the best way to get a hold of you, but we will, of course, make sure that all the links to Peter's social media and his main website is posted in the show notes, so you'll be able to find all those. We're going to be back in just one click for part 2 of our delicious conversation with Peter Williams, who is the author of his second book, which is Productive Accidents. We're going to be back in just one click, so stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about what you need to say yes to rather than no, and how you can get out of your comfort zone and create a whole adventure. Stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.